Several years ago, I lost my father. He and I were very close, as were my kids, as we had stayed in El Paso, Texas, when my siblings had left Texas, and we were the one part of the family that were with him, and my mom almost daily in El Paso. After he passed away, my second oldest child, my son, had a car accident. As a result of this accident, my son had, and still has, a TBI. He was in a coma for a month, then came out of that coma, but remained in a minimally conscious state for another year and a half. It was Ritalin that actually brought my son out of his minimally conscious state to where he could speak again. It had been well over 2 years after my son's accident, while he was an inpatient at a rehab facility in Houston. He was there for therapy after he had shown signs of following commands and was started on Ritalin shortly after being admitted to the rehab facility. About 1 week after we started Ritalin, one day we were riding up the elevator after a day of therapy, and as clear as day, my son asked me, "What happened to me?" I quickly pulled him off the elevator as I heard this, as it had been a long time since my son had spoken. I was in shock. I was ecstatic. I was crying with joy. I pushed him into a waiting area and told him about his accident, about how he had fallen asleep at the wheel and left the roadway and hit two parked U-Haul trailers at full speed. It was a miracle he was alive. I mentioned that my dad must have called in every favor in heaven that he could get my son this far. When I said this to my son, his eyes got wide and he asked me, "What happened to Grandpa?" It broke my heart to realize that due to the brain injuries my son had endured, that he had forgotten that my dad had passed away. That memory had to be one that was lost to my son as a result of the damage to the brain. To tell him this and to see him break down and cry, suffering this loss all over again, was just so heartbreaking. Eventually, he was better, and as time went on at the hospital, he did well in his therapies. One night, while still there, I had a dream. My father came to me in my dream. He told me that he was proud of me for all of the sacrifices I had made to be there for my son, telling me I was a good father for being with him at every step along the way to his healing, and to tell him that he, my son, could get it all back, but that it was going to be the fight of his life. The last thing he said in that dream was to tell my son to stay strong. It was a powerful dream, and it seemed so real. I told my son about it that morning when he awoke. Not long after that, my dad came back to me again. He was sitting next to me in this dream, his right hand on my shoulder, and he was telling me something, but I was having trouble understanding him. It was almost as if he was having trouble speaking, and I told him in this dream, "Dad, I'm having trouble understanding you. Is there something wrong? Why are you talking like that?" He looked at me and mouthed the word "sorry." He then very slowly said, "I forget that where I'm at now, I do not need to use my mouth to speak. This all feels so strange now, and it's hard to speak like I used to. I only want to tell you that I love you. I'm proud of you and happy you are here with your son. I'm going to be watching you too. I cannot say for how long, only for as long as I'm able and allowed. Please remind him that he has to fight now, harder than ever. Tell him, again, to keep strong." I don't know if these visits from my dad were just dreams, but I choose not to think so. It all felt so real and yet surreal at the same time. But his visits came to me at dark times and were sorely needed. I believe there is more to this world, more than we ever get to know and see. I lived in a super haunted house for almost 10 years, and one of the ghosts was super mean. My older son is traumatized from the things he experienced there, stuff he didn't tell me about until we moved. I hardly talk about it either, because I was worried I was going crazy until we moved, and everything that was happening stopped. Just stopped. But when we lived there, the activity was so constant, it got to the point where it was just irritating. It was like constant jump scares in a movie, you know? After a while, it just lost its edge. One of the things the ghost would do is climb into bed with me. I'd be lying in bed and hear the slap of a hand hitting the top of the covers, feel the mattress shake and the weight of someone pulling themselves up onto the bed. And then I'd look, and no one would be there. Happened all the time. But toward the end of us living there, after talking a lot about how much The Ring and The Grudge scare me, I was taking a nap and felt someone climb into bed. I just knew no one would be there. I knew my husband was downstairs and my kids were watching a show, but I couldn't help it. I rolled over and looked and saw a girl towering over me with a dirty white dress and long, dirty black hair covering her face. I jumped, then rolled away, covering my face with my blanket, then groaned and yelled, "Go away!" It sounds absurd, but it totally happened. And it did something like this to my oldest son too, after he saw something on a show that scared him. I was just wondering if anything like this has happened to anyone else. What kind of entity is this? I'm thinking it has to be demonic, but there's so much I just don't know about these things. When I was about 7 years old, my family moved to this old house. The day we moved in, I was holding a snow globe because it was fragile and special to me. I didn't want it to break in one of the many moving boxes. While walking to the house holding it, I remember thinking I wonder what the snow feels like in the globe. Before I finished the full thought, it shattered in my hands. When I told my mom this, she didn't believe me and had thought I'd dropped it. This was the first thing that scared me about this house. The bigger concern is what I kept seeing. This house had a large backyard, and behind our fence were train tracks. My room faced them, and every so often I would see a shadow of a man just standing there. When I went to go get my brothers to look, he'd be gone. One night, I was woken up to a strange repetitive sound. I slowly turned my body to face the room, and there I see the shadow man sitting on my floor. He sits cross-legged. In one hand, there's a piece of wood, and the other is a knife. He sits there whistling. I remember tears forming in my eyes. I'm scared, and I don't know what will happen to me. I don't want to scream in fear that he'll hurt me before my parents could help me. I close my eyes tight. I'm not sure how long I stay awake, but eventually, the whittling is like white noise, and I fall back to sleep. When I wake up, I see wood chips on my floor. I ran to my mom and told her what happened last night. She told me it was a bad dream. I show her all the wood chips on the floor. She makes some excuse. Maybe the dog brought it in. She won't believe me. Over time, I think maybe she's right. This is crazy. I'm crazy. I let her go. A few months after we moved, years later, I'm an adult now, and my mom brings up that house. I tell her that I hated that house and it scared me. She says she knows that's why we only lived there for under a year. She finally admitted she also had encounters there, and when I had my encounter, she knew it was time for us to leave. She didn't want me scared and thought it was better for me not knowing that I'm able to connect with ghosts and spirits like her. I'm unsure what intentions that spirit had, good or bad. For years, I felt alone and crazy. At least now, I'm able to talk to my mom freely about the experience. I'm not a conspiracy nut. I don't believe the moon landing was fake, or that there's a secret world government run by lizards. I'm a sane, rational human being. With that said, I'm convinced my neighbour is building some sort of nest. I'm not joking. Let me explain. I got divorced about a year ago and had to move to a new place on short notice. I got a pretty decent 2-room apartment on the 3rd floor of an old apartment building. The place was probably built in the 50s, but I couldn't get a cleaner or cheaper apartment that isn't out of my price range. I moved in and tried to pick up the pieces of my life. At least my wife took all the heavy and expensive boxes in the divorce settlement. I only saw my neighbours in passing. There were 2 apartments per floor and 5 floors in total. I live on the 3rd floor, and straight across from me is a retired elderly woman. She lives with 2 cats and has a younger man visiting about once a week, probably her son. The 2 apartments below me aren't that interesting. A childless couple, a street across from them, 3 college students. No big deal. The apartment straight above me was probably the most important one. That's the one you gotta look out for when moving to a new place. If anything is gonna disturb you, that'll be the one. You don't want them to be clog dancing enthusiasts, manic cleaners, or the kind of idiot who listens to music with loudspeakers on the bus. The guy who lived above me, Hugo, was an ideal neighbour. He was some kind of accountant who worked at the sanitation department. He kept to himself, never moved a single piece of furniture, and didn't move around much. No slamming doors, no running. He was pretty big body-wise, with a sizable pair of glasses and thinning hairline. He lived alone, seemed friendly, and he was simply the best neighbour I'd ever had. God bless that silent, chunky angel. So let's talk about the nesting. It started a few months ago, in December. It was at the height of the 2020 pandemic, so I was trying to get some minor Christmas shopping done in the off hours of the day. I have flexible work hours, and I can work from home, so I can go out whenever I need to. I was getting a photo printed for my mom and was trying to find a fitting frame. I found this small store with a going out of business sale, and I noticed Hugo browsing some silverware further in. Only, he wasn't alone. Christ, I'm having a hard time describing this woman. She was half his weight, an entire head taller, and she wasn't even wearing heels. Neck like a swan, thin shoulders and gorgeous nutmeg hair. She had a peculiar smell, like a mix of a bittersweet flower and honey. Pale, flawless skin, red nails. I couldn't stop staring at her. Hugo told her something funny, and a laugh seemed to light up the entire room. She grabbed his arm, kissed his cheek, and whispered something back to him. He smiled. I'd never seen him smile before. I saw them buy plates, silverware, and a few blankets. Nothing special. She paid for the whole thing and carried it all out in a tote bag. Hugo just hung to her every word, but they both seemed to genuinely care for one another. It didn't make sense to me. They were basically different species of people. Over the coming days, I noticed some changes. I could sometimes hear laughter coming from the stairwell, and I could hear furniture being moved around during the day. Hugo got himself a new car, one of those large 6-seaters. They were drilling and hammering a few times a week, and on 2 occasions, I noticed Hugo and his girlfriend carrying large carpets up the stairs. He seemed so happy. I don't want to sound like a stalker, but I was curious about the 2 of them. I noticed they changed the names on the door. That's how I learned her name. Sandra. After going through a painful divorce, I'll be the first to admit I was jealous. Sandra was gorgeous, and it didn't make sense for her to be with a guy like Hugo. I was spending weeks on end in lockdown, alone, hearing laughter coming through the ceiling. Yeah, it made me bitter. Sue me. Then, her family moved in. Hugo helped carry a lot of heavy boxes up those stairs, and I caught a glimpse of the whole crew through my back window. Sandra had 2 younger sisters, both just old enough to start high school. Then there was her dad, who looked to be in his early 60s. The whole lot of them were beautiful. Everyone smiling, eager to help, healthy, happy, well-dressed. You can fall in love with either one of them with just a picture. It was weird for so many of them to move into such a small apartment, but I'd seen stranger things. I figured it was a temporary thing, but I changed my mind once I saw the moving vans. Yes, that's vans, plural. 3 vans full of boxes, not a single piece of furniture. Hugo looked exhausted carrying those heavy boxes up and down several flights of stairs. Sandra didn't seem bothered at all. I know, looking at them like that was creepy. I was painfully single, and most of all, bored. As December turned to January, the whole family had settled in quite well. They were still decent neighbours. The hammering and drilling stopped early on, and at most, I would just hear them laughing at something or watching TV. Hugo would leave for work every day, and he'd always leave with a smile. He lost a lot of weight, and he'd gotten himself both contact lenses and fitting clothes. He looked good. Not compared to Sandra, but still, he was getting there. I ran into him in the stairwell once when I was throwing out some trash. He was just coming back from a jog, chugging some kind of sports drink. Hell, he was in better shape than I was. He smiled at me. "Hey, you're in 3B, right?" he asked. "Sure am. And you're 4B. "That's right," he smiled. "Look, if we ever get a bit too noisy, let me know, alright?" "Sure," I nodded. "It's fine, really. No bother. You guys are holding out okay?" Yeah, great, actually. My fiancée got the bug early, so she's got the antibodies. The rest of us just have to wait for the needle." No doubt, no doubt. We smiled at each other and went our separate ways. Just a few steps later, I had to stop myself. I was too curious. "Hey, I gotta ask, how do you guys all live together in that small space? Doesn't it get crowded?" "Always room for family," Hugo smiled and finished his drink. "No room too small, no problem too big." That was the last time I saw him. I stopped seeing him go to work. His car stayed put in the parking lot all day. I'd see Sandra around town, alone. His sisters as well. I noticed her dad throwing out some trash every now and then, but that was it. Hugo just wasn't around anymore. I didn't think too hard about it at first, but in early March, I realized I hadn't seen him for over a month. His name was still on their door, though. Him and Sandra. This is when I started to get a bad vibe. I started to make a habit out of taking notes of things that seemed weird or out of place with Sandra and her family. Like their trash bags. They're not just trash bags. They're these big, blue mesh-type bags that are heat-sealed at the top. Looks like something you'd use to throw out biohazardous waste from a hospital. They were round and packed to the brim, like beach balls. Then there were the nightly excursions. Once the sun started to set, all the sisters would take Hugo's car and go for a ride. They'd only be gone for a few hours, but they did it consistently for at least 4 days every week, mostly on the weekends. But the weirdest thing started in mid-March. For some time, their dad had been throwing out more trash than usual, sometimes several times a day. And at night, I'd hear these weird noises. It sounded like a mix of an engine and a nature documentary. This low, constant droning noise. I tried recording it in my bathroom, where the sound was clearest, but it doesn't sound like much. I'd hear that noise at least once a day, sometimes for an hour or two. It wasn't loud, but it was such an unusual sound that you can't help but to listen. Things escalated gradually. Sometimes I'd watch them come back from their drive with duffel bags full of something. At one point, they just had armfuls of branches and firewood. I'd made notes of all of it, complete with time and date. I was a bit obsessed. I even got out in the middle of the night to check one of their big blue trash bags. I poked one open and felt this intense dirt smell. The bag was just full of some kind of white ceramic and broken glass. I took a piece of the white stuff back home just to get a closer look. At this point, I still thought they were just weird people who'd done something to Hugo. I was still trying to piece it all together. That's the literal thought that made me realize this was something else entirely. To piece something together. I gathered the rest of the white ceramics from the bag and pieced it together. Super glue. An egg. An actual egg, large as a football. This was the remaining shell. I didn't know what to think. I just hid it. All of a sudden, I started seeing that family in a whole new light. Branches, boxes, bags full of something smelling of dirt. In my notebook, I just made a single entry. They're nesting. At this point, it was the beginning of April, and my job was opening up to having people coming back into work. We were forced to come in at least twice a week to note our hours and report to our supervisor. I don't mind getting out of the apartment for a while, even if I had to wear a mask and keep a lot of distance. It was fine. Once when I was coming home, I noticed my front door open. The old lady from across the hall was standing in the hallway, holding one of her cats. Something was going on, and the neighbours were antsy. Just as I was about to enter, Sandra stepped out of my apartment. She fixed her brilliant smile on me, that creepy, gorgeous smile. "We heard noises," she said. "The door was open, and your fire alarm was going crazy." Is there... It's fine," she said. "The super opened it up to see if there was a fire." I walked up to her, and she stepped aside. I gave her a long, questioning look. "Fire alarms don't just start by themselves," I said. "Where's the super?" "He got a call," said the lady across the hall. "He looked upset." "He did," nodded Sandra. "Sounded serious." "I'm sorry if you were all worried," I said, "but please respect my privacy. You can't just go in." "I was just waiting for the super to get back. You forgot to lock your door." "Well, now I'm here, and I can lock it just fine. Thank you." I closed the door, locked it, and locked over my apartment. My notes were gone. The eggshells were gone. My computer had a hard drive malfunction, and there were screws missing from the chassis. Now, they know. The sisters started noticing me more and more. They waved at me every time they took their nightly drive. Their dad gave me a cold look every time we threw out the trash, now in regular non-blue bags. The sounds at night stopped, and I never saw them carry anything inside. I was sure they'd just switched up their schedule, but I wasn't sure. I'd run into them more frequently in person. They'd accidentally meet me in the stairwell every time I went outside. Sandra was always polite, but that smile was hiding something. I felt it. Then there was water damage in the ceiling of my bedroom. Something foul smelling. There was something heavy up there, and the ceiling had started to bulge. I called the supervisor about it, but some man kept telling me that I had to have the papers for an insurance claim before they could fix it. It was bullshit, and they were stalling for time. I think they were trying to cover for the fact that the super hadn't been in for at least a month. I'm not stupid. I knew the super didn't have an assistant. The thing is, I hadn't really been paying attention to my other neighbours. The couple downstairs and the college roommates, they moved out a month earlier. I didn't even think about it. Now I had 8 new neighbours, and they were all very, very pretty. 6 women, 2 men, all in their early 20s and drop-dead gorgeous. The entire apartment complex was full of them now. That weird sound I used to hear seemed to come from every direction at night. They were not even hiding it anymore. They were just carrying all kinds of weird trash up to their apartments. Branches, firewood, plastic, bag after bag of fertilizer and planting dirt. Last week, there were more moving vans coming. Everyone was going outside to help our new neighbours carry their stuff inside. I felt trapped in my own apartment and decided, once and for all, to just leave. Once I stepped into the stairwell, I noticed 8 of them looking at me from all over. They were on the floors above, below, even straight across. Yeah, seems the old lady with the cats moved out as well. Then they screamed. They all just screamed in unison. They were like animals trying to scare away a predator. I could hear boxes dropping and footsteps approaching. I panicked. I glanced at them and burst into a sprint. They were open mouths screaming, feet running, eyes large and dark, like cats getting ready to pounce on a mouse. I took the fire escape out the back, ran, twisted my ankle, and got in my car. I just drove. Something pounded on my back windshield, but I got away. And now I'm here, posting about it. I'm not sure I should look into this. I just want to get as far away as possible. I don't think I'm safe yet. I'm staying with my brother, and just the other day, he told me there was a beautiful young woman asking for me while I was at the grocery store. I don't know what this is, or what they're doing. All I know is that they're nesting, and people are going missing. God, I can't get that noise out of my head. That scream. Those faces. I've had a fear of rats for as long as I can remember. I don't know exactly what it is about them that scares me. It's not just the tail, or the way they move, or the way they sound. It's everything, and it's nothing. To me, rats have always been synonymous with unconditional terror. It all comes from a childhood trauma. A large rat chased me up a hill where I had to hide in a tool shed. The thing seemed rabid, and I had to sit in there for at least an hour, listening to the squeals and cries of the desperate thing that wanted to eat me. It was an unusually big rat, larger than some cats I've seen. It's called musophobia, and up until recently, it hasn't really been an issue. I mean, sure, I can get panic attacks and a flight reaction by just seeing one, but I've been able to keep them out of my life more often than not. Sure, now that I'm a parent, I won't let my two kids have a hamster, but I'm pretty sure the Yorkshire Terrier we have keeps them busy. My phobia became an issue not too long ago. I was driving the kids home from school. Traffic was being rerouted for maintenance, so I had to take a smaller dirt road instead of staying on the main. It wasn't far, and there was barely any traffic. The road goes by a set of fishing cabins set up around the lake. It was extended to lead back to the main road further up ahead. Usually, there's nothing but frogs there. As I drove by, a small family of 6 rats ran straight across the road. This had never happened to me before. My body spasmed and my mind blanked. I panicked and turned the car straight into a pine tree. It was such a strange feeling. I heard this loud scream and tried to cover my ears, only to realize I was the one screaming. My oldest daughter managed to call 911. My reaction was far scarier to Tem than the crash itself. We were fine. I was driving slowly and everyone turned out okay. Even the car was okay, after some light bodywork. However, my wife insisted that I started going to therapy to deal with this fear once and for all. I couldn't say no. Not again. There aren't many mental health professionals in the nearby area, so the list of available therapists wasn't long. I could go for 2 sessions a week if it wasn't too far away. I was looking for assisted exposure therapy, and truth be told, I was a bit on edge about the whole thing. My wife was the driving force behind the decision, so she pretty much just pointed me where to go. She chose to sign me up for a session with Dr. Jane Bogan. Dr. Jane was excited to see me. She was in her 40s and had this combed back Elvira-looking hairdo, but without the volume. At first sight, you might mistake her for a medium or a psychic. It wasn't the best first impression, but her credentials checked out. We shook hands, her wrist rattling with jewellery and chains. She insisted I call her Jane. The office was kind of murky. Dark grey wallpaper with a matching carpet. Plenty of bookshelves with a desk set up by the corner. And of course, fancy leather lounge chairs. The kind you can straighten out to lie down in. Her office assistant Jeremy offered me a coffee and a donut before returning to an adjacent room. Apparently, he helped all 4 officers in the building with their scheduling, but Jane was the only one working today. Jeremy was short. He was a balding man with a tired look. He had some sort of accent, but I couldn't put my finger on what. European, I think. Today, he's all ours, Jane joked. Jeremy didn't laugh. Jane and I had a long talk about my phobia. I told her about the tool shed on the top of that grassy hill and the screeching sounds of the rabid rat. The desperate scratching, trying to make a dent in the front door. I told her about the crash and how my body just seized up and refused to let me act. Jane was a very active listener, asking follow-up questions and making notes along the way. She nodded, made eye contact, and seemed very attentive. She was good, and just talking openly about my fear was refreshing. At the end of the first session, Jane explained her thoughts to me. Until next time, I'll present a treatment plan, but I can already say you're a prime candidate for overexposure therapy. Do you mean exposure therapy? I asked. No, this is different, she smiled and touched my hand. Overexposure is slightly different, but far more effective in the long run. It also doesn't require you to actually meet or touch any rats. It can be done right here in the office. Really? I've never heard of it. I'm licensed to perform it, she said, and stood up. She pointed out a diploma next to her desk. Right there, underneath her degree from Minnesota State, was a license from the Board of Behavioral Health and Therapy, BBHT. It looked official enough, and I didn't have a reason to distrust her. I agreed to discuss it with my wife. Of course, it wasn't much of a discussion. I didn't mind trying something new, and my wife was overjoyed to see me progressing. We tried looking up overexposure therapy, but it didn't give us anything. Most links were just explaining how regular exposure therapy works. I didn't like the idea of facing my fear, but with the guidance of Dr. Jane, it felt a bit easier. She was a professional after all. I called her and agreed to the treatment. She explained it would be best to set aside a full day for it. We booked the upcoming Saturday. It wouldn't be cheap, but she guaranteed a breakthrough. I'd wager my reputation on it, she laughed. The next Saturday, I kissed my wife goodbye and left to see Dr. Jane. I was nervous, but seeing my girls wave goodbye as I pulled out of the driveway calmed my heart. They were so worried about me. I had to get better. When I got to Dr. Jane's office, she was waiting for me in the parking lot. Jeremy was there as well, despite it being a Saturday. My car was the only one in the parking lot, making me wonder if Jane lived nearby and walked to work. As I got out of the car, I noticed Jeremy holding a cup of coffee and a donut. We hadn't even stepped inside yet. He didn't blink much. "Glad you could make it," Jane said. "It's going to be a long day." Jeremy handed me the coffee and donuts as we entered the office. One of the lounge chairs was set up so I could lie down. I noticed how Jeremy lingered in the room until Jane stared him down. Then she turned her attention to me. It felt like staring into a furnace. "Have a seat." I laid down as she dimmed the lights. "Close your eyes and don't be alarmed," she continued. "What are you—" I didn't have time to say anything else. Jane touched her thumb to my forehead, and my mind was set on fire. That's the only way I can explain the sensation. My mind flared and there was an intense heat, wave after wave, fanning out from the point of my forehead she touched. Heat, then freezing cold. There was a taste of metal and a smell of burning rubber, like getting a tattoo on my brain. I couldn't open my eyes, and I couldn't feel my hands or feet. It felt like I was sinking into the chair, deeper and deeper. "Relax," a disembodied voice demanded. I felt my breath stopping. My heart is slowing. Fire turned to ice. I could have sworn I was dying, but my body didn't respond. I was losing control. Then my eyes burst open. It felt like breaching the surface after diving too deep. My pulse shot through my body like an automatic rifle. I was shaking and my eyes teared up. To call it disorienting would be an understatement. I was still in the office, but it was night. I arrived at 10 in the morning, but now it was close to midnight. Jane was gone. Jeremy too. My pockets were empty. I called out, but there was no response. I was alone. I opened the office door and stepped out to the parking lot, only to realize I was, actually, far from alone. There was Jeremy. His eyes were wide open and seemed larger than usual. The pupils were of different sizes. His mouth was open, like a panting dog, revealing a tongue long enough to reach his belly button. He was completely naked and covered in deep, bloodless cuts. He stood in the middle of the parking lot under the single working light post. He seemed taller, like stretched, soft plastic. We locked eyes. His mouth curled into a smile, never blinking, never closing his eyes. And now, he was sprinting towards me with complete abandon. Naked feet slapped against the concrete. He almost tripped as he stumbled across the curb. I slammed the door shut. Jeremy's entire body weight slammed against the door with a deep splat. The door buckled, but held. Jeremy was screaming. It was a pained, primal shriek, like someone being set on fire. All-enveloping pain, expressed in a rasping and dry voice. I hurried back into the office. One of the bookshelves looked loose, so with enough force, I'd be able to tip it. I had to try. The bookshelf itself wasn't heavy, but the over 100 books on psychology held it down. I summoned all my strength and tipped the whole thing in front of the door. I sat down, back on the bookshelf. I noticed I was screaming too, yelling at him to stop and leave me alone. It wasn't a conscious decision. It just happened. I was so disoriented, it seemed like time was standing still. As Jeremy broke through the door leading in from the parking lot, I braced myself. He flung himself against the office door, but the added weight of the bookshelf on myself was enough to keep it shut. "Stop!" I heard myself scream. "Please, just stop!" I scrambled to hold him back, cutting my thumb open on a splinter. I didn't even notice until my hand started slipping from my blood. As I stared across the room, I could see the full moon outside the office window. Slowly, a face appeared on the other side of the glass, stepping out of the dark. A woman I'd never seen before. Hairless, also with deep cuts across her skin. Eyes wide, pupils differently sized. Her mouth wide open, her long tongue pressed against the glass like a dying eel. "No," I heard myself sigh. "Please, just no." She nodded as her mouth turned into a sinister smile. Using her arms and face, she started to break herself against the glass. She didn't bleed from the cuts. I didn't know what to do until the glass shattered. I bolted to the left, through the side door to the hallway. I followed the corridor to the right as the office door broke behind me. Jeremy was through. I could hear the two of them panting as they chased me. I saw two options: get out through a window or lock myself in the bathroom. I refused to corner myself, so I chose the window. I smashed it with my elbow and climbed out, feeling cold fingers brush against my neck. It was cold outside and dark. I just ran, hearing the panting behind me. I followed a path into a pine forest, getting scratches from the trees across my face. It's nothing short of a miracle that I didn't trip. I paid no attention to my feet. As the ground turned upwards to a hill, I lost my breath. I knew this hill, and this couldn't be here. It was the same hill where I'd been chased into a tool shed as a kid. And there it was. There was nowhere else for me to go. They were faster, and I had to find cover. This was impossible. I'd done this once before, and now I was doing it again. I ran up the hill, flung the old wooden door open, and shut it behind me. The door had a side bolt, so I locked it. There were no windows, but the entire shed was flimsy at best. I cursed myself. This was just another dead end. For minutes, it was quiet. Maybe they hadn't followed me. Maybe they took a different path. I relaxed my breath, feeling blood return to my fingers and toes. Then they came. They smashed themselves against the door. They tore at the frail planks. The pained screams exploded and echoed across the hillside. I couldn't hear myself think. Desperate, I looked where to go next, but I was cornered. It can't end like this. It can't. It won't. Not like this. I cried. I pleaded. There were more of them now, at least 6. One of the planks on the left side broke off, and 5 arms reached for me. Pale arms with deep, bloodless cuts. The full moon reflected unblinking eyes and long, slithering tongues. Not like this. The slide bolt had lost 2 screws. It was a matter of seconds. No! I armed myself with a claw hammer as the door burst open. Jeremy was the first in, but I didn't get the chance to attack. 3 different arms grabbed me, disarmed me, and pushed me onto the floor. Cold, naked flesh pressed against me. Countless eager faces drooled with delight as teeth pierced my neck. And then I woke up. The clock showed 20 minutes past 5 in the afternoon. I was on the floor of Dr. Jane's office, curled up in a fetal position. There was a cold towel on my head, and Dr. Jane had calmly stroking my shoulder. My head was warm, and a great headache was subsiding. Jeremy was nowhere around. "There we go," she whispered. "You're fine. You're fine." I couldn't speak. I was shaking like a leaf. Jane helped me back up in the seat. "That was the end of the treatment," she smiled. "You're done." What was... I'd completely forgotten why I was there in the first place. Jane reached for something. "Hold out your hands," she said. I did as she asked. A second later, a small white mouse was placed in my palms. The confused little things just sniffed me and stood on its hind legs. I didn't react. In my mind, I was about to be eaten alive just seconds ago. You seem to be cured, Jane smiled. Treatment successful. You can give him back now if you want. I wouldn't mind holding him for a bit. I really didn't. I wanted the little mouse to stay. It was a tiny comfort, a living creature I could feel meant me no harm. Good, nodded Jane. So, what happened? You were overexposed, said Jane, filling out some paperwork. An extreme stress reaction dampens all other reactions. I don't understand. Say you have an oven with 4 settings, she continued. 4 being the highest setting. That's where you were, with your fear of rats. Maximum power. Strength 4. She handed the paper over to me. It was her bill for the day. I changed your maximum setting to 10. Suddenly, 4 doesn't seem so bad. But how? She sat across from me and locked her eyes to mine. There was something dark in there, a hint of red. I'm very good at what I do. She took my hand and turned it over. That's when I noticed the cut along my thumb. I was allowed to keep the white mouse. I bought him a little cage, some toys, and plenty of food. When I got home that night, my wife couldn't believe her eyes. My girls named the mouse Kenny, and he was gently played with late into the night, much to our Yorkie's dismay. My wife called it a miracle, but I didn't know what to call it. My mind was still in a daze. I found myself thinking back to that day. It wasn't a dream or a vision. It was real. It had to be. Thumbs don't cut themselves on imaginary splinters. Sometimes I find myself staring into the mirror, seeing my pupils dilate into different sizes. Feels like my tongue has grown longer. Hell, my forehead seems to have a slight magnetic pull where Dr. Jane touched me. It's a very unusual kind of headache. There was also an incident just a few days ago where I cut my finger dicing potatoes. Not a drop of blood came out. I barely even felt it. I can't bring myself to go back to Dr. Jane. If there's even a slight chance she'll pull me back on that hill, I won't ever talk to her or see her again. I might have had the fear of rats scared out of me, but it's been replaced by this deep existential dread for what Dr. Jane could do to me if she wanted to. What has she done to me? And why can't I bleed? My Aunt Rachel practically raised me. After a lengthy battle with a terminal illness, she passed last year, leaving what little she had left after the hospital bills were paid. I was to take care of a cockatiel parrot, tugboat, and a collection of 50s cartoon-themed collective plates. Basically, the only 2 items that couldn't be easily sold at an auction. If you saw the plates, you'd see why. Downright creepy things. One in particular, a plate portraying a young cartoon girl feeding apples to a giant frog. It's like the whole thing was made by 2 different people. The girl looked positively Disney, while the frog was more, I don't know, uncomfortably realistic. It was such an odd item that there had to be a collector looking for it somewhere. I was sure of it. Yet for weeks, I couldn't find anyone even remotely interested. I posted pictures of the plate on pretty much every social media account I had, along with a few auction sites, but there were no takers. There were no markings or stamps indicating year or brand, unlike the other plates, and I was starting to think it was custom made. I couldn't stand looking at it, so I put it in a box in the garage. The others went up on a kitchen wall. My aunt would have wanted it that way. I live in a house not too far from the lake, on the outskirts of a small Minnesota town. There were a few houses in the nearby area, but I couldn't even hit the closest neighbor's yard with a rock if I tried. There's only a single street light that works outside, and that thing is flimsier than our summer weather. I rarely have any visitors, as this place can be a bit too out of the way, even for my friends to come by. I inherited this place from my mom, who passed away when I was younger. I'm one of the lucky house owners of my generation, but at what cost? My aunt's bird tugboat fit right in. It was easy for me to fix him in a big cage in one of the back rooms. When you're living in a place on your own like this, You have more space than you know what to do with. My aunt's funeral was simple. She insisted that she pay for it herself, so it had to be as basic and cheap as could be. She hated the thought of ever being a burden, and she practically begged me to take care of Tugboat. You don't say no to that. You just don't. Besides, that bird was damn near the only thing that kept me sane through the COVID pandemic. Having lived in an empty house, you learn to identify most sounds around the property. The hum of the fuse box, the buzzing kitchen lights, the noise from the fridge against the backdrop of a TV that's been on way too long without anyone watching. This was the only reason I ever really took notice that one night when this all started. I was turning on my electric toothbrush one night, only to notice it was completely silent. The motor was running. I felt the vibrations and I saw it spin. But there was no sound, not a peep. Yet I could still hear the TV in the other room just fine. Over the next few days, there were several of these odd instances. Once, the egg timer went off but didn't make a sound, causing me to overboil my breakfast. I thought the ventilation was broken once, but it turned out to have just gone quiet. Hell, at one point, I dropped one of my aunt's collective plates. It shattered against the ceramic tiles, yet didn't make any noise. I was starting to think I was going deaf, but the two doctors I spoke to confirmed my hearing was just fine. Still, the mental image of seeing that falling plate and expecting a loud crash, only for it to remain silent, there was something eerie to it. A friend of mine, Patrick, works for the sheriff's department. We usually had lunch once a week to catch up, but the tradition teetered off during the pandemic. This time, I met him at the supermarket, but barely even noticed him. I had been having trouble sleeping and getting to work on time, as my alarm clock sometimes stayed silent for no apparent reason. My boss wasn't too happy, so I had to start using a vibration alarm. Patrick elbow bumped me by the fruit aisle, snapping me out of my thoughts. "Hey there," he said, grabbing a handful of oranges. "Are you doing okay?" "Yeah, sorry, didn't see you there." "These are crazy times," he said. "I heard about Rachel. I'm sorry I couldn't make the funeral." "That's okay," I nodded. "She never was much for men in uniform." Patrick laughed. We went our separate ways and finished our shopping, only to meet in the parking lot outside. We'd managed to park next to each other without even realizing it. He leaned over the hood of his car. "Hey, have you seen any strangers around?" "After this year, you all seem like strangers." "You know what I mean," he chuckled. "Strangers. Passers-by." "No, sorry. I don't get out much." "Some of your neighbors have had problems, you know. Be careful." "Problems?" He looked at me like a deer in headlights. "You don't know?" Apparently, there'd been reports of a thief. First they thought it was raccoons as someone had gone through the trash cans, but raccoons don't try to pick locks. They also don't leave food behind or human-sized handprints on the windows. Some people had reported seeing a woman with tangled hair roam about, but the police hadn't managed to find her. This is what made me start looking more closely at my own property. I had noticed the garbage can lid gone missing, but I hadn't given it much thought. Also, I could have sworn there were handprints on my car one dewy morning. I tried to tell myself that it was all paranoia, but after what Patrick said, it seemed that everything was a clue or a warning. In my mind, the strange woman was lurking behind every corner. I tried to put it out of my mind. One night, as I heard Tugboat sing his interpretation of Earth, Wind and Fire's September, I took an extra long shower. As I was scrubbing my hair clean, my head went quiet. I could feel the water touching my skin, but it made no sound. Through the door, I could still hear the birds sing his heart out. You'd be surprised how cold warm water can feel when you've got ice in your veins. I rinsed off most of the shampoo and stepped out. There's a small, frosted glass window in my bathroom. The silhouette of a pale face was pressed against it. I screamed, but no sound came out. Tugboat kept singing in the other room, unaware. I grabbed my robe and ran into the kitchen to call Patrick, but I couldn't hear anyone pick up on the other end of the line. I couldn't hear my own words when I spoke. And there, just outside the kitchen window, was the silhouette of an intruder trying to find their way in. A pair of unevenly sized eyes stared at me, slightly too far apart. As our eyes met, she bolted, probably heading back for the door. I picked up my keychain. Tugboat stopped singing from the other room as he sensed something was wrong. As my hearing returned, I could hear the comforting sound of sharp metal from my kitchen knife as I pulled it from a drawer. My pulse was running away from me. It's one thing to think of a home invasion, but to live it violates every thought of privacy and safety you have. It was turning real, fast. There was a large sliding glass door leading out to the backyard, and I figured if there ever came an intruder, it'd be through there. The same room where Tugboat chirped away, but now he's gone quiet. I ran in there, still fresh out of the shower, my knife held in a cramped, forced grip. I almost convinced myself that I was ready to use it. There she was, just outside the door, pale with unkempt hair, eyes of different sizes, slightly too far apart, dressed in what looked like a hospital gown. She was malnourished and frail, but something told me she had the strength of a madwoman. Her eyes darted back and forth, searching for something. As they landed on me, she opened her wide mouth to scream. Not a sound came out. As her mouth grew to an unnatural size, I could feel vibrations in the air, like standing next to a concert loudspeaker. The sliding glass door shattered, the shards fanning out towards me. The knife in my hand started shaking, but I managed to hold it. She stepped inside, her bare feet smearing ribbons of blood on the hardwood floor. She was coming for me, a constant vibration from an unnatural scream tearing through my body. I had to try to call for help and sprinted back into the kitchen. The light bulbs burst overhead, turning the room black. Still, not a single noise. A stray light from the streets outside made its way through the kitchen window, making the room drip with long, pale shadows. My aunt's collective plates rattled on the wall. Glasses along the kitchen sink were cracking and breaking. Empty bottles spilled onto the floor. Cabinet doors shaking back and forth, opening seemingly at random. An old recipe book fell from a countertop, the pages flicking back and forth. I pressed myself against the kitchen window, fumbling to get it open. She'd cornered me. Her mouth was wide open in that impossible scream, her body vibrating with machine-like intensity. The tangled hair twisting and stretching as if thrown about in a storm of its own. Her uneven eyes searched for me, twitching like insects. And still, she didn't make a single sound. There were no humming fans, no buzzing electricity, only a soft breeze outside the window. I couldn't even hear my heartbeat. I managed to stumble out the kitchen window, stepping onto the sharp gravel path. I still held onto my knife like a comfort blanket. I didn't even bother to see if she followed me. I just ran. There was no time to get in the car. I ran into the woods, following a trail that would lead me to my neighbor. Soon, the rhythmic beat of my feet went quiet. My breath, too. I tried to scream for help, but the sound was swallowed. She was right behind me. Long nails reached for me, fingertips touching the edge of my robe. And all around me, nothing but tranquil nature, unbothered by my terror. I was knocked to the ground, scraping my legs against the undergrowth. I slashed with my knife, trying to fight her, as a dainty hand picked up my keys from the side pocket of my robe. I rolled away, only to see the mess of tangled hair walk away. Her uneven eyes gave me a last look as she turned her back to me. She looked like through me without a care in the world. I got to my neighbor. My dirty feet muddied their floor, and by the time the police came, it felt like a waking nightmare. I made my statement, showered for the second time that night, and slept at a nearby motel as the police cleared my house. The next day, I assessed the damage. The house had been searched thoroughly, but nothing was stolen. Not too much was broken either. Seems she was looking for something specific, not trying to steal any valuables. The police were just as dumbfounded as I was, and I didn't report anything stolen. My insurance company would need an explanation, though. It's hard to explain why it looked like the house had been hit by a tornado from the inside, without sounding insane. All the collective plates laid shattered on the floor. Poor Tugboat was so traumatized, he's since stopped singing. Going through the damages was heartbreaking, but it made me take notice of something peculiar. The garage had been searched as well. It was pretty much fine though, at least compared to the house. Among my boxes, I noticed a single item missing. The creepy plate I'd put aside from my aunt. The only one I didn't want in the house. The one with the young cartoon girl feeding the giant frog. It was gone. I guess I found the single collector who wanted it. About a decade ago, I had a brain hemorrhage. It was the first day of my vacation, and my brother rushed me to the hospital. I went from completely without symptoms to brain dead within a couple of hours. Hadn't it been for my mother's unshaking and frankly misplaced faith, they would have pulled the plug on me. Instead, I was kept alive for 3 months. Then, I woke up. It was unceremonious at best. I waved at a nurse who calmly went to fetch a doctor. I fell in and out of consciousness, and in about an hour, I was sitting up on my own bed. I had about a dozen tests and several x-rays, but there was seemingly nothing wrong with me. A bit malnourished and lacking vitamins, but a few hearty meals later, and I was fine. Before my brother was even told about me waking up, I was already on my feet. A bit wobbly, but still. I heard the word miracle thrown around too many times to count. My mother was beside herself, and it cemented her faith in an unhealthy place. She started giving most of her money to faith healers, spirit guides, and mega churches. I know I shouldn't complain. Her attitude might have stayed the hand of someone who in good faith were told to pull the plug. But I just hated seeing her get conned over and over. Still, to her, it all made sense. I had to find a new place to live, and I'd been replaced at my job. I moved in with my brother while I got back to my feet. I still didn't notice any side effects, and in many ways, I was healthier than ever. I stayed with my brother for 2 years before I got a nice job at a lumber mill outside of town and was able to get to my own place. And up until about a year and a half ago, everything was fine. Then, things started to feel weird. At first I thought my old health problems were flaring back up. Every day on my commute to work, I was getting headaches, dizziness, and sudden bursts of neck pain. It got so bad that I started dreading the drive to and from work more than work itself. I went to a doctor and the results were confusing. Turns out, I had a small growth in the back of my cranium. It had a strange shape, more mechanical than organic. It was metallic in nature, about the size of the palm of my hand. The doctor showed me an x-ray, describing it as a strange tattoo on the inside of my skull. My first thought was that it looked like a circuit board, but organic. The doctor had no idea what to do. It was such a large area that surgery would be severely life-threatening, and the blood work didn't show any elevated levels. If anything, whatever had grown in the back of my head was benign. I was given stronger pain medication and sent home. They suggested I started keeping a pain journal. For 8 months, my symptoms gradually got worse. I took my medication, but the relief was temporary. I put a lot of time and effort on my pain journal, trying my best to look for patterns. The only pattern I could find was my commute to work. Just as I got to work and just as I got home was by far the 2 worst times of the day. I started taking different routes, working from home and trying different strategies. To my surprise, some of it would work. Working from home was the best solution, but also taking a longer route. Step by step, I started narrowing in on the problem. It was the strangest thing. There's a deep tunnel that connects our town to I-94, and that stretch of land was causing me discomfort. It wasn't an immediate pain, but every time I avoided that tunnel, I'd feel a lot better afterwards. I decided to prove it once and for all. I stayed in the middle of that tunnel for about 15 minutes. My symptoms were wreaking havoc and growing worse. Pain, dizziness, loss of balance. That was only the start. It felt like I was being tased and every source of light became blinding. My stomach twisted and turned, and I was about to lose consciousness. I heard a scream. I didn't even realize it was my own. I had to be taken out by ambulance. The reaction was almost identical to when I first collapsed from my hemorrhage all those years ago. My brother had almost crashed his car rushing to the hospital, and my mother almost had a heart attack. Luckily, I'd woken up by the time they got there. I wasn't even mad. I finally knew what was causing my pain. Over the coming weeks, I narrowed down the problem further. It was just that tunnel in particular. It was any kind of tunnel. But it wasn't just tunnels either, but staying long enough underground would cause a similar effect. I took care not to block out again, yet the symptoms were the same every time. I knew that whenever I started hearing screams, I had to get out. A crazy thought came to me. If staying underground was causing me pain, what would happen if I reached higher altitudes? So I took a flight to my college buddy over in New Hampshire. Halfway through the flight, I had to use the restroom. My head was feeling light and cold, like I had ice between my ears. I was getting different symptoms than usual. Vibrations in the base of my neck, uncontrollable eye movement, hyperventilation, drooling. I was a mess. I stayed in the bathroom for 30 minutes, then it all just stopped. As I stepped out, I felt amazing, better than I had in years. No pain, no stress. My body felt relaxed and limber, like I stepped out of a good massage. I only recently learned that during that time I spent in the bathroom, the flight controls and autopilot stopped working. There was also an issue with the in-flight movie, which was picking up massive amounts of static noise. I had no idea. During my time in New Hampshire, I felt like a new person. I'd get these different symptoms every time I spent time on elevated ground. A high hill, a tall building, anything. Vibrations, hyperventilation, eye movement, all of it. It came rushing back to me, and I'd feel amazing afterwards. Hell, I was losing weight and gaining muscle without even trying. I felt several years younger and could function with no more than 3 hours of sleep. After 2 weeks, I was longing for the flight back home. I wanted to get back up in the clouds and feel that euphoria again. I was getting attuned to it. I'd get giddy thinking about it, and people were starting to notice my new positivity. I was at one point just asked whether I started taking drugs. The second flight was almost a disaster. I stayed in the bathroom for 45 minutes, and during that time, the plane was almost falling out of the sky. The flight controls and autopilot were going berserk, and every instrument was showing the same crazy set of numbers over and over. I'll never forget it. 02, 12, 01, 13, 05, 12, 05, 19, 19. I know this for one simple reason. The same was happening to me. I'd hear bursts of screeches and beeps, the same pattern over and over. After 45 minutes, a flight attendant burst through the door. They laid me down and poured cold water over me. I had an inhumane fever, and my skin was turning red. They had to put a blanket in my mouth to keep me from biting off my own tongue. One flight attendant told me, after we landed, that my eyes were bulging to the point where they thought they'd pop out. In my head, I'd hear the same sequence of beeps and screeches over and over. Somewhere in the back of my mind, there was a voice. A woman calling to me. The last thing I remember from that flight was looking out through a window, seeing the cumulus clouds over New Hampshire. I could have sworn something out there blinked at me. They had to make an emergency landing, and I was examined at the gate. I'd lost consciousness, but I was regaining it quickly. One of the flight attendants stayed a while to talk to me, while the paramedics made sure I was okay. They were also cordial, but this is also where something started to go very wrong. I couldn't see their faces anymore. It was all just a blur. Swirls of skin with fat splotches of black and white. Their voices would distort, like I was hearing them underwater. I'd see the spots where their eyes should be, floating around their liquid head, their mouths opening and closing seemingly at random, like a trout out of focus. I was scared out of my mind, and they had to give me a powerful tranquilizer. I dreamt about clouds. Clouds with eyes. My mum and brother came to see me in the hospital. They tried to comfort and to support me, but I couldn't stop looking at their faces. I was scared they might get blurry and start moving around. At one point, I heard their voices distort, and I felt my heart race. A team of nurses had to race in, and no one could see me for another 6 hours. I woke up in the middle of the night. My mum was still sitting next to my bed, holding my hand. Her face was gone, and her voice changed pitch seemingly at random. The swirling mess of features focused on me. My heart was skipping beats to the same repeated pattern I could hear in my head. It made me think of the same numbers I'd imagined back on the plane. "You should be thankful," the voice murmured. "You should be so thankful." "For what, Mom?" "I asked him to come save you, and he did." "He saved you, love." "Who? Who saved me?" She leaned over to whisper. I could hear crackling, like teeth mashing together. A slithering sound, like a dry tongue dragged across a rough surface. "The man from the computer. He told me he'd save you." "What man? Who are you talking about?" "The hatchet man." The words were cold. I leaned back, taking a closer look at my mom. Without her usual voice, it was like talking to a stranger. In the dark, I barely recognized her. She had unusual clothes, but it was her shoes that made me take notice. Those were sneakers, far too large for her feet. Like a bolt of lightning, the swirling face disappeared. It was like pulling back a curtain from my mind. A stranger was sitting in front of me, a complete stranger. A man, early 40s or late 30s, rugged with a wild beard, a hoodie, and completely black eyes. It was hard to tell if they were extremely large pupils or just solid black. The man stood up, pulled out some sort of cable from my arm, and snapped his finger. Every single electronic item in the room fell silent. I tried screaming for help, but he just snapped his fingers again. My mind is cramped. "Testing," he said in a low, rumbling voice. "Testing." His eyes flashed yellow, and I couldn't breathe. I counted 10 excruciating seconds before my throat opened up. The stranger leaned over me, his fingers ready to snap. "Without the hatchet, man, you'd still be brain dead, you ungrateful shit. Now stay fucking still." I was frozen. I felt that my pulse wanted to race, but something was holding me back. Something was controlling my bodily functions. The stranger reinserted a needle into my arm and held up an otherworldly black handheld device. There was a series of beeps, the same pattern. Then it was done. He took out the needle and headed for the door. What is this?" "Nothing," he smiled. "Just a hotfix." He snapped his fingers again, and the world went dark. I've since talked to my mother about this. She believes I dreamt the whole thing, but she was surprised that I found out about her donation to the Hatchet Man. Apparently, that was the username that showed up on a donation to the Church of the 13 Chisels. Mama tried everything, but it was after that donation that I had just woken up. She considers herself part of their flock and a follower nowadays. Of course, there's no such thing as the Church of the 13 Chisels. They send out a monthly email that's just a copy-pasted version of an email from a televangelist with some names switched around. The physical address is fake, and every single picture on their website is just copied pictures from other churches with photoshopped faces. The entire thing is a scam, a shell. Still, here I am. Ever since that night, I've been a lot more stable. I can go through tunnels without feeling bad, but I also don't feel different while flying. There are no swirling faces, distorted voices, or odd sequences in the back of my head. Still, I've been to the doctor, and the organic metal growth in the back of my head remains. It just seems to be a bit more passive. The strangeness. Maybe it was just fixed. I don't know if I should be worried. I don't know what this means, and I don't know where to look for answers. Do you guys have any theories? I think the growth saved my life, but I'm not sure what to expect. This must have happened for a reason. I don't feel like I'm doing anything involuntarily, and I don't feel like something is affecting me. But maybe it will. Someday.